David Jackson, a black Marine veteran, pulled up to the sprawling gates of his luxury mansion just as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon. After months of deployment overseas, the sight of his home, quiet, familiar, and untouched, should have brought relief. Instead, his heart pounded with confusion as flashing blue and red lights reflected off the polished marble driveway. Police cruisers were parked outside, their engines idling softly, and two officers stood near the front door, speaking in low voices. David stepped out of his black SUV, his military discipline immediately kicking in despite the knot tightening in his chest. The officer who approached him was a tall man with a serious expression, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we need to verify your identity before you enter the property," he said, voice firm but not unfriendly. "I'm David Jackson," David replied, pulling out his military ID and driver's license. "I live here." The officer scanned the ID carefully, then radioed back to dispatch for confirmation. "We had a call from your neighbor, Cynthia Reynolds. She reported a suspicious individual attempting to break into this residence. Before we continue the story, please make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on your notifications for more daily stories. Drop a comment to let us know which city or country you're watching from." David frowned, glancing toward the house's front door. "That's impossible. I'm the owner and I've been away on active duty. Who is this Cynthia Reynolds?" The officer hesitated, then nodded toward a woman standing a few feet away. Cynthia, a middle-aged white woman with a stern face, was watching David intently. Her arms were crossed, and she wore a badge from the local homeowners association pinned to her blouse. Before David could say anything else, Cynthia stepped forward. "I've been living here for the past 3 weeks," she announced, her tone defiant. "This house was empty, and I took it upon myself to move in and protect the neighborhood while you were gone." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "You've been living in my house without my permission?" "Yes," Cynthia replied firmly. "The homeowners association approved it. I'm just trying to keep the area safe." The officers exchanged glances, clearly caught between their duty to respect property rights and the unusual situation unfolding before them. One officer motioned for David to step aside as they continued to discuss the situation with Cynthia. David's mind raced. The house had been his sanctuary before he left for deployment, a place where he could decompress from the chaos of war. Now it seemed invaded not by criminals, but by someone who believed she had the right to occupy it in his absence. The sting of betrayal was acute, compounded by the fact that the person asserting control was a neighbor he barely knew. The front door creaked open, and Cynthia led the officers inside, gesturing for David to follow. As he stepped through the threshold, he was hit by the faint smell of cooking, a scent unfamiliar and out of place. The living room looked lived in with personal items scattered on the coffee table. A pair of reading glasses, an open book, and a half-empty glass of wine. "This is my home," David said quietly, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and anger. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks, Cynthia replied, as if it were a badge of honor. "I made sure everything was looked after. The neighborhood needed someone inside." David walked further into the house, noting the subtle changes Cynthia had made. Family photos replaced by framed pictures of neighborhood watch meetings. His mail sorted into piles on the kitchen counter and fresh flowers in a vase on the dining table. "This is trespassing," David said firmly, turning to face Cynthia. "You had no right. You didn't ask. And the HOA doesn't have authority over my private property." Cynthia's expression hardened. "The HOA operates for the good of the community. We had concerns about break-ins and vandalism while you were away. I thought it was better someone was inside than the house sitting vacant and vulnerable." David shook his head, disbelief and frustration mounting. "You made decisions about my property without my consent. That's not protection. That's possession." The officers began taking notes, carefully documenting the scene and the statements from both parties. The tension in the room was palpable as David struggled to process the reality that the place he called home had been commandeered in his absence. Outside, neighbors began to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and low murmur of voices. Some watched silently, while others whispered among themselves, eyes flicking between David and Cynthia. The neighborhood was a tight-knit community, and news of the unusual standoff was spreading quickly. Cynthia noticed the crowd and raised her voice. "I'm just trying to keep our neighborhood safe. We can't afford to be passive while crime arises." David's jaw tightened. "Safety doesn't come at the cost of violating someone else's rights. You don't get to decide who lives in my home." The officers stepped between the two, attempting to diffuse the growing tension. "Ma'am, you need to leave the property," one of them said to Cynthia. "This is the owner's residence." Cynthia's eyes flashed with defiance, but she said nothing. Instead, she began gathering a few belongings into a tote bag she carried. David watched as she moved through his home, feeling a mixture of anger, violation, and disbelief. As Cynthia exited the house under police supervision, David stood at the doorway, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. The place that was supposed to be his refuge had been compromised not by strangers breaking in, but by a neighbor convinced she knew better. The officers closed the gates behind Cynthia, and David was finally allowed to lock the door behind him. He took a deep breath and looked back at his home, a sense of resolve starting to build amidst the shock. This was only the beginning. David stepped back inside his home, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt both protective and fragile. The officers lingered near the entrance, their presence a silent reminder of the unusual breach he had just endured. Cynthia Reynolds had left, but the traces of her occupancy clung stubbornly to every corner of the mansion. He moved through the rooms, eyes scanning for further signs of intrusion. In the study, his desk was cluttered with papers rearranged into neat stacks, a stark contrast to his usual haphazard order. On the wall hung a whiteboard filled with notes about neighborhood watch schedules and security patrols, notes he had never seen before. A calendar marked with meetings and community events was pinned prominently, the handwriting unfamiliar. His personal laptop rested on the chair, its screen locked but clearly used. In the kitchen, dishes sat drying in the rack, and a half-empty bottle of olive oil was open on the countertop. A note written in bold black marker on a sticky pad read, "Neighbors feel safer knowing someone is home." David crumpled it, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. One of the officers approached, his voice low and professional. "Mr. Jackson, do you want us to document everything you find as evidence? It may be useful if you decide to take legal action." David nodded. "Absolutely. I want a full record of this. It's not just about the trespassing. It's about the violation of my privacy and property." The officer pulled out his camera and began photographing the rooms, capturing every detail that suggested unauthorized occupancy. David felt a wave of helplessness wash over him as he watched the documentation unfold. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, yet now it felt like a crime scene. Cynthia's justification echoed in his mind. She claimed she had HOA approval, that she was acting in the neighborhood's best interest. But David knew the rules, and he knew that the Homeowners Association had no authority to grant anyone residence in a privately owned property. His protests to the officers made this clear, but Cynthia's confidence suggested she believed otherwise. Determined to confront this head-on, David asked the officers to accompany him to the HOA office. He needed to verify Cynthia's claims and understand if there had been any official sanction of her actions. At the HOA headquarters, David was met with polite but evasive responses. The board members insisted they had not authorized anyone to occupy a resident's home without explicit consent. Cynthia's actions were described as unilateral and not representative of the association's policies. Yet there was no formal record of reprimand or steps taken to prevent her from acting as she did. Frustration mounted as David realized how loosely the HOA's boundaries were being defined and enforced. Cynthia had operated under a self-appointed mandate, blurring the lines between community vigilance and personal overreach. Back at his mansion, David confronted Cynthia one last time as she returned briefly to collect a few personal items she had left behind. The air was thick with tension. "You had no right to do this," David said, his voice steady but firm. "The HOA didn't authorize you. This was your decision alone." Cynthia met his gaze evenly. "I did what was necessary. The neighborhood was vulnerable and no one else was willing to step up." "Vulnerability doesn't justify breaking the law," David replied. "You crossed a line into my home, my life, my privacy." Their exchange drew the attention of the officers who reminded Cynthia that she was on private property without permission. She gathered her belongings quietly, but her demeanor remained unrepentant. Word of the confrontation spread quickly among neighbors, many of whom expressed mixed feelings. Some admired Cynthia's commitment to safety, praising her for taking initiative during David's absence. Others sympathized with David, condemning the invasion of his personal space and the disregard for legal boundaries. Neighbors who had once seen Cynthia as a dedicated HOA member began to question her methods. Rumors circulated about her motivations and the true extent of her involvement in community affairs. David found himself at the center of a growing controversy, his role as a homeowner pitted against Cynthia's self-styled guardianship. Despite the turmoil, David remained focused on reclaiming his home and his peace of mind. He began reaching out to trusted friends and legal advisors, seeking guidance on how to navigate the complex intersection of neighborly concern, HOA authority, and property rights. Throughout the ordeal, David reflected on the delicate balance between community safety and individual freedoms. Cynthia's actions, though framed as protective, had undermined the very principles she claimed to uphold. Her disregard for boundaries revealed a troubling dynamic, one where control was disguised as care and authority was assumed rather than granted. As the officers wrapped up their investigation that day, David stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by the remnants of Cynthia's presence. The silence was heavy, but beneath it lay a resolve to restore order and respect. He knew the path ahead would be challenging. Cynthia's defiance and the neighborhood's divided opinions meant this was more than a simple trespassing case. It was a confrontation over who had the right to define and enforce the rules of their shared space. David's thoughts drifted to his time in the military, where discipline, respect, and clear command structures were paramount. Here in the quiet suburb he called home. Those principles felt contested and fragile, but David was determined. He would not let this violation stand unchallenged. The house was his, and with it the right to decide who belonged within its walls. As the evening shadows lengthened outside, David prepared to take the next steps. Armed with evidence, conviction, and the support of those who believed that property rights and personal dignity must never be compromised, word of the incident spread swiftly through the neighborhood, carried on whispers and pointed glances from porch to porch. By the next morning, clusters of residents had gathered near David Jackson's mansion, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and quiet judgment. The luxurious facade of the estate now seemed a stage for a neighborhood drama that had unexpectedly fractured the community's sense of unity. Some neighbors expressed support for Cynthia Reynolds, praising her vigilance and willingness to act, when others remained passive. "She was just trying to protect us," one woman said, arms crossed as she spoke to a small group near the corner mailbox. "With crime on the rise, we need people like Cynthia watching out for us." Others took a different view, their voices tinged with unease and disapproval. "Trespassing is trespassing," an older man argued, shaking his head. No matter how good her intentions, she had no right to move into someone else's home without permission. The air was thick with tension as neighbors debated in hushed tones, the incident exposing deeper divisions within the community. Some saw the event as a necessary precaution in uncertain times. Others viewed it as a dangerous overreach that threatened personal freedoms and property rights. At the local community center that evening, the Homeowners Association convened an emergency meeting to address the growing unrest. The room was packed, residents packed shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the board members seated at the front. David arrived early, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was met with a mix of nods of support and weary stares. The HOA president, a middle-aged man with a measured tone, opened the floor. "We recognize that recent events have caused concern and confusion. Our role is to maintain the safety and harmony of this neighborhood, but we must also respect the rights of individual homeowners." David took the microphone when invited. His voice was calm but resolute. "I want to be clear. What happened at my home was not an act of community protection. It was trespassing. Cynthia Reynolds acted without my consent or the board's authorization. This is about respect for property rights and personal boundaries." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged skeptical glances. Cynthia stood as well, her posture defensive but unwavering. "I moved in because no one else would. The neighborhood was vulnerable, and I felt compelled to act. If that makes me a vigilante, then so be it. The debate grew heated as neighbors voiced their opinions. Some defended Cynthia's initiative, emphasizing the need for proactive measures against a perceived rise in local crime. "We can't wait for permission to keep ourselves safe," one resident argued. "Sometimes we have to take matters into our own hands." Others warned against setting dangerous precedents. Allowing someone to occupy a home without permission undermines the very fabric of trust and legality that holds this community together, another resident counted. The discussion revealed a polarized neighborhood, split between those prioritizing collective security and those insisting on individual rights and legal process. The HOA board struggled to mediate, attempting to reaffirm policies that respected both concerns, but lacked the clear authority to enforce them decisively. Outside the meeting, conversations continued, neighbors forming small groups to debate the incident's implications. Some questioned whether Cynthia's actions were motivated solely by concern or if a desire for control had influenced her decisions. Others expressed sympathy for David, recognizing the violation he had suffered after serving his country. Rumors began circulating about previous disputes involving Cynthia, suggesting a pattern of overstepping boundaries under the guise of community service. Meanwhile, David found himself increasingly isolated by the complexities of neighborhood politics, even as many voiced private support for his stance. The incident sparked broader conversations about race, privilege, and power within the community. David, as a black homeowner and veteran, was acutely aware of the undercurrents that influenced perceptions and reactions. Some neighbors who supported Cynthia's actions seemed unconsciously influenced by biases that complicated the dialogue. Community leaders attempted to steer the conversation toward constructive solutions, proposing neighborhood watch programs with clear guidelines and homeowner involvement. Yet the fracture remained, a visible scar on the neighborhood's sense of cohesion. As days passed, the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted. Casual greetings became strained. Porch conversations were tinged with caution. The incident had ignited questions about trust, authority, and the limits of neighborly intervention. David continued to engage with residents willing to listen, sharing his perspective on the importance of respecting legal boundaries and fostering genuine community cooperation. He emphasized that safety could not come at the expense of rights and dignity. Cynthia, meanwhile, began organizing meetings of her own, rallying neighbors who felt similarly about the need for assertive protection. Her determination did not waver even as criticism mounted. The escalating divide prompted some residents to call for an impartial mediator to help the community navigate the tension. The HOA board acknowledged the need for healing, but admitted their limited capacity to resolve the deep-seated issues exposed by the incident. Amid the turmoil, David reflected on the complexities of home and belonging. His house was more than a structure. It was a symbol of his identity, his service, and his right to peace. The intrusion had shaken that foundation, but it had also galvanized his commitment to stand firm. The neighborhood watched closely as the story unfolded, their opinions shaped by personal experiences, fears, and hopes. The conflict was no longer just about a single house. It had become a catalyst for examining the values and boundaries that define their community. In the quiet moments between the noise, David found solace in the support of close friends and family. They reminded him of his strength and the importance of asserting his rights with dignity and clarity. As the neighborhood remained divided, the stage was set for further confrontations and conversations. The incident had opened wounds that would not heal quickly, but it also offered an opportunity for honest dialogue about respect, safety, and the meaning of home. For David Jackson, the challenge was clear: to reclaim not just his property, but the trust and understanding necessary to rebuild a fractured community. David Jackson sat in the quiet of his living room, the evening light casting long shadows across the walls that had once felt like a refuge, but now bore the marks of intrusion. The decision to pursue legal action against Cynthia Reynolds had not come lightly. It was a step he had hoped to avoid, but the boundaries she had crossed demanded accountability. The legal complaint was filed promptly, charging Cynthia with trespassing and unlawful occupation of private property. David's attorney emphasized the seriousness of the offense, framing it not only as a violation of property rights, but as an affront to personal dignity and the rule of law. The case quickly drew attention beyond the neighborhood, highlighting the tension between individual ownership and community oversight. Cynthia, undeterred by the legal pressure, launched a campaign to justify her actions. She reached out to neighbors and HOA members, framing herself as a protector of the community who had courageously stepped in when others hesitated. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, social media posts were shared, and emails circulated, all painting her as a guardian against rising crime, not a trespasser. At HOA meetings, Cynthia's supporters rallied behind her. They argued that the association needed more authority to act decisively in times of perceived danger. "We need to empower those who are willing to protect us," Cynthia declared at one gathering, her voice steady and passionate. David attended these meetings, often facing a hostile crowd. Some neighbors accused him of being inflexible, unwilling to understand the community's needs. Others whispered about the racial dynamics at play, suggesting that Cynthia's actions were tolerated because of biases that complicated the situation. The HOA board found itself caught in the crossfire. They attempted to mediate, proposing revisions to community guidelines that would clarify the limits of authority and establish protocols for homeowner absence. However, these efforts struggled to gain unanimous support, revealing fractures within the association's leadership and membership. As the legal process unfolded, depositions and statements were gathered. David's attorney presented detailed evidence, photographs of the altered home, testimonies from neighbors who witnessed Cynthia's behavior, and records confirming the lack of HOA authorization. The narrative painted a picture of unilateral action taken without consent, disrupting the peace and privacy of a homeowner. Cynthia's defense centered on her intent rather than her legality. She argued that her actions stemmed from a genuine concern for safety and community welfare. "If my intentions were questioned, it is a tragedy," she stated in her testimony. "But the neighborhood was at risk and I chose to act." The courtroom became a venue not just for legal argument, but for a broader debate about the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility. The judge listened carefully as both sides laid out their cases, aware that the outcome could set a precedent for similar disputes. Meanwhile, the neighborhood remained divided. Conversations in local cafes and playgrounds reflected the ongoing tension. Some residents expressed regret that the situation had escalated to legal battles rather than neighborly resolutions. Others felt vindicated by David's stance, seeing it as necessary to uphold respect and boundaries. David found little solace in the public scrutiny, but remained resolute. The violation he experienced was personal and profound, and he was determined to ensure that no one else would face similar trespass under the guise of community protection. Behind closed doors, David grappled with the complexity of the conflict. He recognized that the story was not just about property, but about trust, race, and power within a community struggling to define itself. As hearings progressed, Cynthia's credibility began to wane. Several neighbors came forward with accounts of previous incidents where she had overstepped boundaries, reinforcing the pattern of behavior that had escalated with David's home. The HOA board, once hesitant, started distancing itself from her claims, emphasizing the importance of consent and lawful action. David's legal team used these revelations to strengthen their case, presenting a comprehensive argument that underscored the necessity of respecting personal property and the dangers of unchecked authority within neighborhood associations. The media attention, though unwelcome, brought broader awareness to the issues at stake. Discussions about homeowners' rights, HOA powers, and racial dynamics reverberated beyond the community, sparking conversations in legal circles and among civil rights advocates. Throughout the ordeal, David remained a steady figure measured in his responses, focused on justice rather than retribution. He sought not only to reclaim his home, but to foster a greater understanding of the delicate balance between community safety and individual freedoms. The legal proceedings continued to unfold, each hearing peeling back layers of the conflict and revealing the intricate social fabric entangled with the simple act of residing in one's own home. David knew that the resolution would shape not only his future, but the very character of the neighborhood he had returned to after serving his country. In quiet moments, David reflected on the lessons learned, the importance of clear boundaries, the dangers of assumptions, and the necessity of dialogue grounded in respect and empathy. The fight was far from over, but he was prepared to see it through, determined to restore not just his property, but the principles that defined it. As the community braced for the next chapter in this unfolding story, the lines between neighbor and adversary remained blurred. The path toward reconciliation uncertain, but necessary. David stood ready, embodying both the vulnerability and strength of a man defending his rightful place in the world. The mediation hearing was held in a modest conference room at the county courthouse, a neutral ground where David Jackson and Cynthia Reynolds faced each other one last time before a third-party mediator. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of unresolved grievances, guarded hope, and the weight of months of conflict. David sat with his attorney, his posture calm but firm. Across the table, Cynthia's expression was a complex blend of defiance and weariness. The mediator, a seasoned professional known for navigating delicate disputes, opened the session by emphasizing the goal to find common ground and restore civility, if not agreement. David spoke first. His voice was measured, reflecting the journey he had endured. I returned home from deployment to find that my property had been invaded not by strangers, but by someone from my own community. This was not an act of neighborly concern. It was a violation of my rights and my privacy. He detailed how Cynthia had moved in without permission, altering his personal space and using his belongings. Yet, he acknowledged the complexity of the situation. I understand that there were concerns about safety, but safeguarding a neighborhood cannot come at the expense of individual ownership and respect, Cynthia responded, her tone softer than in previous encounters. I believed I was protecting the community. The mediator guided the conversation towards solutions. They discussed the importance of clear boundaries between homeowners and the HOA, the need for transparent communication, and the establishment of protocols for neighborhood safety that honored legal rights. David advocated for a reevaluation of HOA powers, insisting that the association should not act without explicit homeowner consent. He stressed that while community vigilance was important, it must be balanced with respect for personal freedoms. Cynthia agreed to step back from her self-appointed role, acknowledging that her approach had been flawed. She committed to working within the HOA's established framework and supporting initiatives that involved collective decision-making. Neighbors who had followed the case closely watched the mediation's progress with cautious optimism. The HOA board present as observers took notes and expressed willingness to revise policies to prevent similar conflicts. As the mediation concluded, David reflected on how the ordeal had transformed his understanding of community dynamics. He had learned that vigilance and care must be tempered by respect and trust. True safety could only emerge from cooperation, grounded in clear boundaries and mutual understanding. The neighborhood, too, began to shift. Conversations resumed with a renewed focus on healing divisions and fostering genuine connections. The incident had exposed fractures, but it also created an impetus for dialogue and growth. David recognized that while he could not control how others perceived him or Cynthia, he could control his response and the respect he demanded. His stand had reaffirmed the sanctity of his home and his right to privacy. In the weeks following the mediation, the HOA implemented new guidelines that emphasized homeowner consent and transparent communication. Neighborhood watch programs were restructured to include training and clear protocols, ensuring that no individual could unilaterally make decisions affecting others' properties. Cynthia, stepping back from her previous role, began attending meetings as a regular member, contributing to discussions with a more collaborative spirit. David, while cautious, engaged with the community in ways that balanced vigilance with openness. The experience left a lasting imprint on David, deepening his appreciation for the complexities of neighborly relations. He understood that home was more than a physical space. It was a reflection of trust, dignity, and shared responsibility. As he stood on his porch one evening, watching neighbors greet each other with genuine smiles rather than guarded glances, David felt a sense of cautious hope. The conflict had been painful, but it had also paved the way for a more respectful and understanding community. The journey had reaffirmed that while boundaries must be guarded, they need not divide. With empathy and clear communication, it was possible to build a neighborhood where safety and respect coexisted. David's story became a quiet reminder to all who lived there. That vigilance, when balanced with respect, could protect not just homes, but the very fabric of community. Thanks for watching. If you love the story, like the video and please subscribe.